The invisible hands behind every panic. Panic never starts where people are looking. It forms quietly, behind routines, assumptions, and signals most dismiss as background noise. By the time fear becomes visible, the forces shaping it have already been at work for weeks, sometimes months. To understand why this matters, we have to move away from the idea that panics are caused by singular shocks. They rarely are. What triggers panic is not the event itself, but how the system interprets it. And that interpretation is shaped by invisible hands, mechanisms, incentives, and behaviors that guide reactions long before emotion takes over. At the center of every panic is coordination failure. Participants are not responding to fundamentals alone. They are responding to expectations about what others will do. When confidence is high, this coordination works smoothly. When confidence weakens, the same coordination accelerates fear. Everyone acts rationally in isolation, yet the collective outcome becomes destructive. The early signals are subtle. Liquidity thins slightly. Volatility clusters in unusual places. Correlations rise where independence once existed. None of this feels alarming on its own, but together, these shifts indicate that behavior is synchronizing, and synchronization under stress is dangerous. What makes these forces invisible is their normality. They are embedded in market structure, risk management, and incentives, stop-loss rules, margin requirements, funding models that depend on continuous rollover. Each is designed for safety, yet under pressure, they activate simultaneously, turning protection into propulsion. The system does not panic because it lacks rules. It panics because too many rules trigger the same response at the same time. Selling becomes automatic. Withdrawal becomes rational. Waiting becomes safer than acting. And once these responses align, panic no longer needs bad news to sustain itself. This is a reveal most people miss. Panics are not emotional outbursts. They are mechanical outcomes of structure meeting uncertainty. Fear spreads not because people lose control, but because systems behave exactly as designed when conditions change. The invisible hands do not cause panic intentionally. They amplify it unintentionally. And by the time panic appears on the surface, those hands have already done their work. Understanding them is the difference between reacting to crises and preventing them. Once panic begins to form, these invisible mechanisms shift from background processes to dominant forces. Actions that once felt independent begin to mirror one another. Risk limits are hit simultaneously. Margin calls cascade. Liquidity thresholds are breached in parallel. What looked like diversity of behavior suddenly collapses into uniform response. Institutions do not intend to amplify fear. They follow rules designed to protect themselves. When volatility rises, exposure is reduced. When prices fall, collateral is demanded. When funding becomes uncertain, lending is withdrawn. Each step is rational. Each is defensive. But when taken together, they compress the system, removing flexibility at the exact moment it is most needed. This is where panic accelerates. The market stops reacting to new information and starts reacting to its own reactions. Price moves trigger safeguards. Safeguards trigger selling. Selling confirms fear. The loop tightens with no single decision-maker in control. Panic no longer requires bad news. Structure sustains it. What makes this phase dangerous is its speed. These mechanisms operate faster than human judgment. By the time concern is voiced, responses are already underway. By the time reassurance arrives, positions have been closed. The system has moved on, leaving intention behind. The public often misreads this moment. It looks like irrational behavior, like mass overreaction. But inside institutions, nothing feels irrational. Rules are followed. Procedures are executed. Risk is reduced exactly as planned. The panic is not emotional. It is procedural. The reveal deepens here. Stability mechanisms are neutral only in isolation. In combination, they create momentum. When uncertainty rises, the system does not slow itself down. It accelerates towards safety, draining liquidity and magnifying stress. This is the early conflict fully unfolding. The system is protecting itself so efficiently that it undermines its own stability. Safeguards collide. incentives align, and the invisible hands tighten their grip. At this stage, stopping panic requires more than reassurance. It requires interrupting the mechanisms themselves. Because when protection becomes synchronized, it stops being protection. It becomes propulsion. As the mechanisms locked into motion, the system entered its most dangerous phase. Panic no longer depended on perception. It was embedded into process. Even participants who recognized the pattern found themselves unable to stop it, constrained by rules that allowed no discretion once thresholds were crossed. Funding markets tightened abruptly. Institutions that relied on short-term borrowing faced immediate pressure, not because they were insolvent, but because lenders responded to uncertainty by stepping back all at once. What had once been a rolling, routine exchange became a test of survival. Access, not value, determined outcomes. The emotional peak emerged in this realization. Panic was no longer about fear of loss. It was about fear of exclusion. Being last act meant being locked out of liquidity, trapped in positions no one else would touch. Under those conditions, restraint felt reckless. Speed became self-defense. Coordination collapsed completely. Everyone knew that if someone else sold, waiting was dangerous. But if no one sold, stability might return. The problem was trust. No one could be sure what others would do, and the cost of guessing wrong felt catastrophic. So everyone acted. This is where invisible hands reveal their full power. Stop losses trigger at once. Margin requirements tighten simultaneously. Risk models signal reduction in unison. What was designed to protect individual actors overwhelms the collective system. Intervention becomes unavoidable at this point, not because markets lack discipline, but because discipline has become too rigid. Flexibility has been engineered out. The system can no longer pause itself. The buildup had reached exhaustion. Panic was no longer spreading. It was executing. The breaking point arrived when it became clear that panic was no longer emotional. It was automatic. The system was doing exactly what it had been programmed to do, and that precision was now the problem. Protection had turned into acceleration, and acceleration was pushing the entire structure toward failure. The climax came through interruption. Authority stepped in not to calm emotions, but to disrupt mechanics. Rules were paused. Thresholds were softened. Liquidity was injected not as reassurance, but as friction, something to slow the machine down. The goal was not to stop fear, but to stop the processes that fear had hijacked. Once the mechanisms were interrupted, the system began to breathe again. Not immediately, not smoothly, but gradually. With margin calls eased and funding access restored, participants no longer feared exclusion. The urgency to act first diminished. Coordination, force from the outside, began to replace the chaos created from within. The resolution revealed a difficult truth. Panics are not just psychological events. They are structural outcomes. They emerge when too many safety systems respond the same way at the same time. Preventing the next panic does not mean eliminating fear. It means designing systems that do not amplify it automatically. In the aftermath, thinking shifted. Safeguards were redesigned to allow discretion. Speed was treated as a risk factor. Diversity of response became as important as strength of capital. The invisible hands were no longer ignored. They were studied. The lesson endured. Stability cannot rely solely on protection. It must preserve flexibility. Systems must be able to hesitate, absorb, and adapt, especially when uncertainty rises. Because panic does not need bad actors. It only needs well-intentioned rules acting in perfect unison. Subscribe to join the journey. The